if your program is staying static, you've actually lost market share. And I think that's where programs aren't really thinking about it. And so this standing still paradox is throwing some math in to say, okay, here's what's the competitive market, and then what is your market share? And if you're not careful, it's declining. So as an example, 20 years ago, you might have 100 beds. And all of a sudden, if you've seen the population double, so that means all of a sudden the market share is doubled. Mm-hmm. But your 100 beds is still your 100 beds. Well, you've actually lost relevance. TikTok doesn't work for everybody. But if you're not experimenting with it in a cost-effective way, you won't know if your market makes sense for TikTok. Because you may not want to do it personally, but the market, again, thinking about the highway and the cars that are now driving 70, that short form content, that is where the younger market is. Whether you like it or not, they're there.
Welcome back to Mastermind. I'm your host, Mark Scrivner, and today I'm joined by Lee Pepper. Lee, great to have you here, man.
Mark, it's so great to be here with you, and I'm glad that we get to keep doing these OG episodes.
Yeah, man, this is going to be a good one, too. Lee's been sitting with an idea he's calling the standing still paradox. And Lee, I'm excited to jump into this and educate the audience on really what that means and how you came about that. So let's dig right into it and just talk about, I know you've been sitting with this idea of the standing still paradox, which a lot of treatment centers face. And maybe let's break it down, what it means, what they should be aware of, and how they can make sure it doesn't happen to them.
Yeah, I think, Mark, you get these calls. I get these calls. I know our co-host Jeff Skillen, who couldn't be here today, gets these kind of calls too. But a lot of treatment centers, especially legacy treatment centers, they deal with this issue of, I'm still being consistent. Mm-hmm. I've got the same BD team that does amazing work. They're well known in the community. I've got this same great clinical team that's providing great care, but I don't know why my census is starting to kind of incrementally inch down. What's going on? And so as I've had these conversations and brainstorming with different teams, I started thinking about this concept of, you're on this highway and you're driving your car down the road, but yet you're all of a sudden noticing the highway's gone from 2 lanes to 6 lanes. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden your car, the speed limit used to be 55 miles an hour like it was when we were kids, and now it's 70 miles an hour. And all of a sudden there's new exits and off-ramps and new rest stops. There's Buc-ee's all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. And yet you're still just being consistent. And so I use that analogy with some of my clients to explain why their relevancy is actually going. They're slipping, even though they're being consistent and they're kind of being that legacy stalwart program, but the competition has overtaken them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, then the question is, well, how do we move forward? How do we stay competitive when our competitors are racing forward? So that's where I came up with this idea that I'm calling the standing still paradox, because you could be doing this, and there's math to it, but you could just be staying consistent, and you think all your status reports are showing green, but you're actually losing to your competitors. And I think that's what a lot of the programs don't really understand. They don't understand the speed that their competitors are at.
It's almost like the frog that's sitting in the pot of water that's warming up to a boil, and they don't really realize it until it's boiling. So I'm a treatment center operator, and I'm in a market that is growing significantly, and everything's great. I'm running it status quo for the 4 or 5 years, and then all of a sudden I look around and man, there's so many more treatment centers. My census is starting to decline a little bit, but I really haven't done a ton over that 5 years to expand, invest, whatever. Is that what I'm picking up?
No, absolutely. And, as part of this idea, I'm working on a second book, that I've been telling you about. So I'm hoping to get the manuscript finished by the end of this year. But a lot of research I've been doing. And one of the examples that, because I'm from Tennessee, that kind of resonated with me is that, I grew up in Tennessee, and we've had an enormous amount of growth. So, I was born in '69. So I started looking back, going back, 50, 60 years, and our population has almost doubled since 1966. And just since 1996, around the time that I was graduating college, the population in Tennessee has gone up almost 40%. And then, but when you look at actual licensed beds in our state, licensed hospital beds have not increased at that same rate. There's only been like about a 12% increase. But what that data doesn't explain is that we now have outpatient beds. We now have virtual care. And so if you're an operator and you're just kind of looking at certain metrics, you're missing out on where the competition is now swamping you. Again, in the example of driving down the highway, we now have wider lanes. We now have new exits. And that's where I think a lot of times your status reporting can show all green, but you're missing out on what the competition is doing.
And I mean, those numbers, that growth of 44%, really, I think if you took in the statistical metropolitan market, it's much, much higher than that. And I know a lot of our programs, they draw from a big area. So, I mean, it's even bigger than that.
Yeah. Well, in Tennessee, I have a number of clients in Tennessee, and as I sometimes commiserate, because I'll have regular lunches with folks. It's a confusing time because they're not sure. Like, well, I'm still doing my residential, and so they still have their same bed count, and they just don't understand that all of a sudden you've got your competition that's actually got more beds now, newer beds. And so if your program is staying static, you've actually lost market share. And I think that's where programs aren't really thinking about it. And so the standing still paradox is throwing some math in to say, okay, here's what's the competitive market, and then what is your market share? And if you're not careful, it's declining. So as an example, 20 years ago, you might have 100 beds. And all of a sudden, if you've seen the population double, so that means all of a sudden the market share is doubled. But your 100 beds is still your 100 beds. Well, you've actually lost relevance.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to have some math to kind of explain that, so people go, oh, this could be pointing to why my census is actually declining now, because people have so much more options that they can consider.
Yeah. Well, I've heard you talk about this in the past, and maybe you could help walk us through the 1,000 customers in a 5,000 person market example, and why that number is more dangerous than it looks.
Yeah, so I made some notes as we were coming here. So as an example, if 10 years ago you say the market demand in your space was 100, okay, well, I'm going to be able we think there's 100 people that need our treatment in 10 years ago. And if you were doing 30 of that 100, so you had 30% of the market share, right? Your competitors had 70. All of a sudden now, 10 years later, in the present, all of a sudden your population has grown, or maybe there's more avenues of care, introducing outpatient or virtual. So now all of a sudden the market demand, the people that need your service, is now doubled. So you've gone from 100 to 200 in 10 years. But you're still just at 30. You still just have your 30 beds as an example. Well, your competitors are filling now not just 70, your competitors are now filling 170. So your market percentage, your share is now dropped from 30% to 15%. And when you now start to throw in the marketing budget, so now you're not just competing against the 70, and you can start doing your cost per bed calculations on this. All of a sudden, you multiply that times not just 70, but 170. See, all of a sudden, your budget you've lost ground. Even though you've been stable, you might have been filling 9% of your beds. You're just staying green, 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 green. And all of a sudden, one day you realize, you wake up and go, uh-oh, what's happening? And these people that are your competitors, they have a 10-year head start on you because they've been building. And all of a sudden, you've been caught flat-footed. And so that's kind of what I've been doing a lot of research and writing about, is how do we start to get this concept across to companies, especially behavioral health, so that they don't wake up 10 years later and flat-footed, because now they've got it. Now you have to not only respond to the immediate crisis, but they've got a 10-year head start on you. And that gets expensive. when you try to solve that.
Yeah, well, I mean, and we have a lot of programs in some of these growing markets, like the Nashville for sure, but you've got Austin, you've got Charlotte, you've got Denver, you've got a lot of markets that are really expanding. So this is more important than ever for operators to hear this message.
Yeah. And there has to be, I'm really big about math because I think that you've got to put some math to it. It's got to be objective. And there's going to be some great formulas that I will share in my writings that I think can help people start to actually quantify what this threat is.
Yeah, well, I think you've actually framed it for me in the past of like company growth minus like market growth equals like relative decline.
Exactly.
And maybe just talk about like that formula.
Yeah. So here's the example in the one I just shared. So if your company shares 30%, but the market growth has doubled, you just subtract that. You're now in the negative.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to get across to people is that you can be standing still.
Yeah.
You can be doing great care. You can have your beds basically full for all these years, but you may be losing ground. Every year you're losing ground. And all of a sudden when you realize it, it might be painful.
Yeah.
It's never too late, but it's going to be painful. And I think that that's what surprises CFOs and CEOs and owner founders. They're doing all this great work, but they didn't realize the speed of the competition.
Yeah. So I'm a marketer and I'm reporting to the C-suite on what we're accomplishing. And the dashboards all look great. They look stable, like we're, hey, slight growth, maybe flat, but hopefully some growth in that. And everything's looking good, but the market is starting to retreat.
Boy, if you're a marketer today and you are not providing competitive analysis to your C-suite, you're missing out. And if you don't have somebody that can talk that language, you're missing out too, because your marketer, they've got to keep an eye on what's going on, keep that car going down the road. But that marketer has also got to be the one informing your board and your C-suite that, hey, our 55 miles per hour, it's kind of irrelevant now because cars are going 70. Or, hey, our gas-powered engine, there's electric cars now. Or, hey, we were just covering 2 lanes, we now got to cover 6. You need to have somebody that can talk that language and explain it and put it into some objectionable terms.
Yeah.
Because then the thing is, it's easy to point out the problems. But how do you respond? And there's lots of classic examples, and I'm going to be sharing some of those in my writing. But Uber's a great one. All of a sudden, you think the taxi industry, they got caught flat-footed.
Oh yeah,
completely. And it was because of basically this new creation. And I think behavioral health is in an inflection point like that too. And you look at this week, UHS. Who I had some dealings with UHS when Foundation sold to UHS, but they just bought Talkspace. They're looking ahead. They're wondering what is the market, not just from leads, but also for a step down care. And so that's going to be a potential threat to a lot of the behavioral health providers if they're not paying attention.
Yeah, well, coming from your last book and putting on the military lens here, I know that you lean hard into Patton on this. What is the military framework that we should be thinking about to make sure that we're going to stay ahead of this?
There's a famous quote for those of you that haven't seen the 1970 movie, Patton. It's one of my favorite movies. I keep it on my iPad to watch on long air flights. But there is a quote from George Patton that he basically, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, but he basically said he didn't want any reports that they were holding ground. He said the only thing that I want you holding on to is the enemy. And I think that is a problem sometimes in marketing because you may have these constraints, whether it's budget or financial, where you feel like you can only just kind of hold your ground. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. And I think that in my book, Never Outmatched, I lay out some ways that people using force multiplication can kind of avoid that. But if you were just holding your ground, holding steady, you're actually going to be losing your market share.
Yeah. Well, so as an operator, what are the most important things that I should be looking at today from just the market's growing, and what would be your like assessment of here's the top like one or two things that you got to be aware of.
Yeah, I think for the owner founders today in the C-suite, you really need to understand quantifiably what is your competition. It's not enough to know that, oh, well, I've got this treatment center down the road or that treatment. Like, okay, well, how many beds do they have? What are their current offerings? Are they doing all levels of care? Are they doing outpatient, IOP? Are they offering virtual? And you need to quantify that. And you need to compare that over time so you'll know that, okay, well, 10 years ago, this is where I was. It's where I'm at today. Oh, and then look how the competition has grown. And if you don't understand the new providers, and listen, you and I know this because we get calls all the time. There are new providers popping up every day. And so you need to understand like what that's like in the marketplace. And you also need to understand the new treatment modalities that may be coming, right? And so it's not enough to say, well, I don't do MAT, so I'm not going to consider them a competitor. Yeah, you do need, because the consumers are the ones that are considering them competitors.
Yeah.
So you need to understand, like, even though you may not offer that service, it's in your area, your sphere, so you need to look at them as competitors.
Support for Mastermind comes from our sponsor, Snapshot Health. In the world of behavioral health, growth must be balanced with ethics and mission. Snapshot Health specializes in performance-driven marketing designed to help behavioral and addiction treatment centers. To learn how to build scalable systems for sustainable growth, visit the link in our show notes. You know, Lee, I mean, that's interesting to hear about all the different service lines that you could be offering, because we've also talked a lot in the past about like the riches are in the niches. So like, how do I like balance this as a operator?
Yeah, I think the first thing is a lot of people may hear this and go, oh my God, I got to hire a full-time. No, I'm not suggesting that you spend 40 hours a week on competitive analysis. But there ought to be some standard that you either as the chief marketing officer or the chief development officer, that you're spending a few hours a month actually digging in and tracking and understanding this, so that when the time comes or you're doing some type of reporting, that you actually have invested the time so that you're knowledgeable. But I find so many people, when they call me, they're not knowledgeable. They're not really clear, or they hear about a place opening 6 months later. No, you need to know about it the day they open, or maybe hopefully even before. And I'm not suggesting, again, that you spend 40 hours a week doing this, but there ought to be a handful of hours each month that you're dedicating to this competitive analysis.
Yeah.
And that goes beyond just knowing the brick and mortar, the people that are in your direct service line, but also understanding the market. Like I mentioned, UHS and Talkspace. Like, you probably need to understand like what's going on there to see how is that going to impact your potential business.
Yeah, where are you seeing it get hit the hardest? Is it residential, outpatient, IOP? Like,
I think traditional, I use the term legacy. It doesn't even have to be old, really old programs, but I think traditional programs are the ones that seem to be struggling with the hardest. And I think part of it is because those programs have great reputations in general. They've been around for a very long time. They've been very consistent. But that consistency can sometimes lead to this thing that people have written about called organizational inertia. And when you are not able to identify that, raise your hand and go, yeah, we suffer from it, then you're not able to deal with it. And so think about your organization. You may be very traditional and stagnant, having a CEO, a COO. You might have a CIO, a CFO. If that's kind of been your C-suite for all these many, many years, that could also be a problem, because maybe you need to have a chief innovation officer, or maybe you need a chief growth officer, or a chief, whatever it is. There are programs that are innovating at that leadership level that keeps them lean and hungry and understanding the competition a lot better than just maybe a traditional setup. So it can't just be that your clinical program is also changing. Your leadership program may also need some injection.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, we work with PE-backed companies, we work with nonprofits, we work with independents. So, but just how do the small family-owned independent operators, how do they compete with the PE-backed Because there's a ton of consolidation going on in the market right now.
Well, the first thing I would always say, and I've worked on both sides, is that PE back doesn't always mean they know how to run your business. I find that PE is very disciplined when it comes to financial management and being creative with how you finance this, but they may not necessarily understand the market or understand the clinical. So I think that's key. And then on the flip side, I find that PE is also the ones that are also pushing innovation. So, some companies that are not PE backed may be missing out there. Mm-hmm. So I think the key is, and I was just on a call this morning with one of my clients in Miami, and I was so impressed. He was showing me this documentation that his digital marketing person had put together, and it was so wonderful because it was just documented, and it was really laid out well. And I complimented him and his team that put that together, because I think that's the key. You have to get some documentation. It's okay to have a spreadsheet, right? And to actually be tracking things. So that would be the first thing, is that are you getting something that's trackable? Because once you have a little bit of data, now you can actually take some action on it. If it's just me and you, it's subjective and kind of just, I think this or think that, that's just opinion. But if you can get a few metrics down on paper, now you've got something to be actionable on. And we're not always going to get it right the first time. But you have something now you can iterate on, and I think that's super important.
Lee, I know we've talked about it in the past, but you led a turnaround with Paloma, and how did you use this lens to help with that turnaround?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Before I came up with the standing still paradox, this is going back 10 years. We were having some struggles at our Memphis facility called La Paloma, 72 bed. It was unique because it was duly licensed mental health and substance use, which you can do in Tennessee. And we were having trouble. Like, it had been a stalwart for us for many, many years. And we were not able to keep it at our budgeted census level. And so a lot of people had opinions. I remember, having these very difficult conversations. People thought we should be advertising nationally. They didn't understand why we couldn't, fly people into Memphis, this and that. So I took the team. We went to Memphis, and we spent 2 full days there. The majority of our marketing team, there's a lot of people, like 15, 16 people went down there, and we really spent time with the staff, walking the campus and understanding what was going on. And we came back and we started doing an analysis. We started looking at where the patients were coming from, what was the payer mix. And we did a full analysis, and what we presented then back to the team, and we did it quickly. Within 60 days, we had this presentation ready to go. Was that our issue was that we had a turnaround problem, that we had documented a number of instances where people were showing up at the facility. They would get to the front door and they were kind of like not impressed by what they were seeing, and they would do a U-turn. So part of our presentation was no more U-turns, and so some of that was that. The grounds were that had not been upkeep. I remember the first day seeing the American flag was tattered, which gets me as a veteran. We had a broken guard shack when you first drove on the property. The arm was broken, and that was just kind of a symptom. Great people doing great work, but we had not kept up with the capital investment in the program. So we did a whole presentation, and the board agreed to spend $1 million there that year to start doing things like revamping and making it more of a park-like setting. We actually went in and put new mattresses. We had very lumpy mattresses. We had all these photos of very lumpy. So we need to put new mattresses. All these things that we were getting kind of critiqued negatively on in the marketplace, we went in and resolved so that now we were competitive. Because here's the thing: we had new places, UHS being one of them, that had just opened up in our market, and guess what? They've got brand new mattresses, right? They've got a beautiful grounds, right? They've got a sport court, basketball, all these things that we just didn't have after all these years. And so to be competitive, we had to kind of up our game.
Yeah, we talk about it all the time of how marketing touches almost every aspect of your program. And it's like, even the redoing the grounds, investing that money, that is marketing.
Because here's the thing. We were being pressured to spend money in national advertising. Like, why aren't we getting people to fly in? That wasn't our problem. our problem was a local problem. And again, everywhere is different. We did the same thing for our Malibu facility because the team was impressed with what we did there in Memphis. And so all the CEOs were wanting to come out and do things. And so every market's a little different. But I could have just said, yeah, let's start spending more on AdWords nationally. But I was never going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
I might get people there, but they were doing U-turns. So that one was a local issue. We needed to be dominant in our local market and maybe regionally. I didn't really need to be advertising in California to get people to come to Memphis. Just didn't need to, especially for 70 beds. Now, our Malibu situation at the Canyon, it was a little bit different because we were doing national and international advertising because it was more expensive. People were flying in. So they had when we went in and did analysis there, we had a little bit different take on that. We realized that in that situation, we were failing on the marketing side to really promote the type of personalized experience that Kathleen and her team were providing. So we dove into, we need to explain that our executive chef, it was there because we were able to provide the type of nutrition that our clients were. So if you needed gluten-free, no problem. We've got somebody there that can do gluten-free.
Yeah.
If you need vegetarian, if you're whatever it was, we were able to respond to that. And the very specific requirements that level of care needed, we weren't advertising it very well. So again, a different solution. Yeah.
Well, what I'm taking away from that, though, Lee, is if I'm an operator right now and my program looks tired, tired from the grounds, tired from the inside, the beds, all of that, then I better start taking notice of that.
Because your competition didn't build their new program with tired property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about population growth. We've talked about rise in demand. We've talked about rising competitors within the market, and they're all compounding at once.
Yeah.
Like, what is, out of those three, what are operators underestimating the most?
I think, I tell you, in this example of the population growth, if you're in an area where the population is growing, you have to demand, why is my program not growing?
At that same rate?
You have to, close to
Similar.
it. Like, why not? I mean, you're the owner operating, and if you have this amazing service that is saving people's lives and getting them to lead this sober lifestyle for the rest of their lives, don't you want to share it? You should be demanding your team to keep up with that rising population growth. You shouldn't be stagnant. You shouldn't be standing still.
Yeah.
And it's okay to ask the question, why not? It doesn't solve the problem of how you get there always, but you should be demanding that you're keeping up with the rising population growth. Similarly, you should be demanding, like, okay, well, if all of a sudden we've got all these treatment options, why have I not figured out how to deliver my treatment in that model? It doesn't mean that you're going to go that way, but you ought to be asking those questions and trying to document like what it would take.
Great point. Yeah. Well, in our world too, Lee, I'd love for you to lean in a little bit to like the social media, the AI. Like, how should we be focusing on this today to ensure that we're staying way ahead?
It's just like we were saying, you have to devote some amount of hours each month to competitive analysis. Same thing with innovation. If you can't spend a few hours taking out of your day to go, I need to go maybe do this webinar, or let me go see how this program is being innovative, like, you're missing out. You're going to get caught flat-footed.
Yeah.
So whether it's we're not saying that you got to jump into AI, but you need to be at least understanding and know who is using it and where the pitfalls are and where the successes are.
Yeah.
And if you can't spend a couple of hours out of your month, I'm not even saying out of your day, but out of your month to kind of keep up, you are going to get caught flat-footed. And, of course, I love the military analogies, because a lot of my research, even for the second book, is going to have some military analogies because it's very, native to me. But, I think about I was doing research yesterday about when the Air Force came into being. Originally you just had the Army and the Navy. And my grandfather, who served in World War II, was in the Army Air Corps. Well, the Army Air Corps is what eventually became the Air Force, right? And it could have been that in the 1950s we could have just said, well, we'll just add more planes to the Army. No, they realized that there had been a change and that we needed a new department, right, to handle our air assets. So they created the Air Force. And the same thing has happened in 2019 with the Space Force. We identified that space is a new frontier, and all the services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, were all kind of playing with some ideas, but we needed a new department. So that is a great example of how if big organizations like that can understand the need for innovation and how they kind of change, surely your treatment center can also be thinking about, maybe there are some new tricks that I can learn as an old dog.
Yeah, and like the one thing that's always stuck with me about from your book has been the term force multiplication. And I know we've talked about it on past episodes, and it's like, I think it's more important than ever before to be thinking in these terms across multiple like platforms for an operator, and how you can get the very most out of the content that you're producing. And maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, force multiplication was one of the first concepts that I came up with at Foundations, and then that's what became kind of the leading narrative for my book. And I think that especially for finance people that are listening to this, because they're already sitting there, probably the dollar signs are starting to ring in their head. That's why force multiplication was an important concept, because it allowed us to be competitive back 15 years ago without breaking the budget.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what the message that owner-operators and C-suites and board members need to hear out of this episode is that I am not suggesting you just keep throwing money after it, right? That's not going to solve it. But you need to be innovative. And so things like force multiplication can allow a team to take a piece of content and be able to put it on different platforms without breaking the bank. And then as you measure those platforms, you'll understand what makes sense. As an example, TikTok. TikTok doesn't work for everybody. But if you're not experimenting with it in a cost-effective way, you won't know if your market makes sense for TikTok. And so just to say, well, we're not going to do TikTok is a real mistake, because you may not want to do it personally, but the market, again, thinking about the highway and the cars that are now driving 70, that short-form content, that is where the younger market is. Whether you like it or not, they're there. Now you have to decide how your treatment center can work within that. But I think that's where force multiplication allows companies in a budget-friendly way to solve that issue of how they create content and multiply it on all these different platforms.
God, what a good lesson, Lee. Like, as we're starting to wrap up, maybe if a legacy program is in a growing market and things look very good, they're status quo, like, hey, we're staying pretty stable, what is the one question that you think they ought to ask themselves tonight?
I think that, again, leaning back to what we see in Nashville, as we see all of the new development, all the subdivisions, all the high rises, you have to be saying, why have I not added more beds? I mean, you have to ask the question. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do it, but you have to ask the question, because if you're not filling the need, your competitors are. And when your competitors are filling that need, they're now more marketing spend, right? They have this innovation drive, and all of a sudden you're still standing still, but you're losing ground, you're losing relevance, and that's when you start to see the census start to tick down, because now instead of having 5 competitors, you now have 10.
Yeah.
Now instead of the market, say it was $1 million marketing spend in your little area, now it's $2 million, and yet you're just a small part of that. That's the danger, is that you cannot afford to just be satisfied with just filling your 30 beds as the example. Because all of a sudden that 30 beds with all the competition, you start to have your census decline.
Yeah. Is there one specific metric based on that they ought to start tracking tomorrow, or paying close attention to?
I think that you should understand a couple of things. One, you need to understand, if you're residential, you need to understand bed count, location count, because it's not enough to say, well, I've got 3 locations. Okay, well, there might now be 300 locations with competitors. So, and sometimes, if you're just looking at one metric, you're going to miss out. So I think you need to be looking at population growth, bed count. You need to be looking at levels of care offerings, location. Those, when you start to kind of have a little bit wider set, you can start to pick up on some of these trends. If you're just looking at one metric, that's where I get back to a lot of us just look at our kind of status report we've done for years, and it's all showing green. I don't know why it's going down. Well, maybe you need to add some more metrics so you can catch some of these trends. So, and again, when you're just doing the research and tracking, it's not a big ask, right, to get this data on a monthly or a quarterly basis. It's not a big ask. It's not like you're needing to spend hours and hours doing this.
Yeah, Lee, man, great show, great lesson. Man, there's so many nuggets of wisdom that I hope that program operators are going to pull out of this show and keep in front of mind and in focus over the next year or two as the market continues to grow.
Absolutely.
And all their markets continue to grow. So thanks for being a part of it.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for joining us today. If today's episode sparked any interest, please drop any questions or comments in the comments section, and we'll get them answered for you. Also, as the Mastermind community continues to grow, we would reach out and ask you all, are there people that we ought to ask to be on the show that maybe you think could be a valuable contributor to our message as we continue to build this great community? So drop those as well in the show notes, and we'll definitely act on them. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Mastermind.
That wraps up this episode of Mastermind. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember, Mastermind is not just a podcast, it's a community. So don't forget to comment, subscribe, and review us. Your feedback helps us continue to bring you content that's relevant and relatable. Thanks again to our sponsor, Snapshot, a digital media marketing agency. And thank you for joining us on Mastermind, your behavioral health playbook.